Hello and welcome to this second video, produced as part of the Reveal project. And this video is going to focus on ethical theories, both from a high-level theoretical standpoint, and also focus on some of the key thinkers around library and information ethics. As such, it's one of the longer videos in the series, so there is a prompt to pause halfway through the video if you feel you need a rest. Now, the Reveal project focuses on ethics and values for effective advocacy for libraries. It was funded by the CILIPS Research Fund, and the aim is to enhance collective advocacy across the profession through an accessible framework for library and information ethics and values, presented as a set of continuing professional development tools. And these videos form part of that set of tools. This is the second video in a series of 10. So this video focuses on ethical theories, as well as key ethical thinkers in libraries. And as you can see, the rest of the videos focus on different aspects of advocacy, as well as ethical values. So structuring this first part of the discussion. This first part is focused around ethical theories that predominate in society. It's built on the framework discussed by Michael Sandel in his book Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? And the second part of the video will focus on ethics and ethical thinkers in library and information science. So focusing firstly on ethical theories in society. Michael Sandel asks a series of questions regarding social justice and the ethical frameworks that guide them, and the considerations of citizens throughout the world. He asks, does a just society seek to promote the virtues of its citizens? Or should law be neutral towards competing conceptions of virtue, so that citizens can be free to choose for themselves the best way to live? Now, we will explore some of these concepts as we go through the video. Essentially, Sandel suggests three approaches to justice as larger containers for the ethical approaches that predominate. And these containers are welfare, freedom, and virtue. And we will discuss each of them in turn. But it's important to note that even within this set of containers, tensions do exist. They do work well as categories, however, they are complex. So ultimately, you might say that ancient theories of justice start with virtue, while modern theories start with freedom. But Michael Sandel concedes that this contrast can mislead. Therefore, we can often see values mix between the three types, meaning understanding all three is vitally important. In reality, as Sandel says, some of our debates reflect disagreement about what it means to maximise welfare, or respect freedom, or cultivate virtue. Others involve disagreement about what to do when these ideals conflict. Political philosophy cannot resolve these disagreements once and for all, but it can give shape to the arguments we have and bring moral clarity to the alternatives we confront as democratic citizens. And this is absolutely the case as well when we apply these theories to our work in libraries, as we will see later. So the first category is welfare. Now, Sandel defines welfare as relating to happiness of citizens in a broad sense. The main ethical theory related to maximising welfare is utilitarianism, which was a theory proposed by the 18th century legal scholar, philosopher, and social campaigner Jeremy Bentham. Utilitarianism is a teleological theory, meaning that it exists to further certain ends, and those ends are what should be the overarching focus, not necessarily how those ends are achieved. So the purpose is what matters. Utilitarianism's focus was happiness for the largest number, and utility for Bentham meant whatever produces pleasure or happiness, and whatever prevents pain or suffering. Now, utilitarianism has been a hugely influential philosophy until well into the 20th century, and arguably many professions remain sympathetic to its tenet of maximising happiness for the largest number. For instance, the growth in things like public institutions, like parks, museums and libraries in the 19th century can be traced to this ethos. And even today, it's not uncommon to find people advocating for public services from a utilitarian standpoint. For example, the basic argument that libraries and museums are good things for society. It's essentially at its core a utilitarian argument, given the focus of the argument is on maximising access to something for the benefit of the majority of citizens. So you will often see that kind of argument used, especially for libraries. Libraries are a good thing on their face. And, that is a reasonable argument. But equally, it's a utilitarian argument. And if you are not programmed to think that way from a philosophical standpoint, you may not agree with it. Now, the criticisms of utilitarianism were many, but they mostly fell around the issue of human rights. As a result, the philosophy has fallen out of fashion quite a bit due to these criticisms. And here's a quote from Sandel. He says, "The most glaring weakness of utilitarianism, many argue, is that it fails to respect individual rights. By caring only about the sum of satisfactions, it can run roughshod over individual people. For the utilitarian, individuals matter, but only in the sense that each person's preferences should be counted along with everyone else's. But this means that the utilitarian logic, if consistently applied, could sanction ways of treating persons that violate what we think of as fundamental norms of decency and respect." So what he means essentially there is, taken to its extreme, utilitarianism can lead to discrimination of minorities so that the majority benefits. In a much lesser sense, in libraries, for instance, it could be argued utilitarianism allows access to libraries at the expense of individual authors and publishers who lose money through it. So you can even bring the argument down to its library-focused element. Now, another key criticism of utilitarianism is that it can essentially lead to what Sandel has dubbed a single currency of value when you're measuring public goods, which means that often no nuance or consideration of quality or decency is applied. And this is summarised in the famous quote from Bentham related to whether or not it's better for society to promote activities that are deemed to be of higher quality than others. His response to that was that quantity of pleasure being equal, push-pin is as good as poetry. And push-pin was a children's game from that era. So the argument here for Bentham is, it doesn't actually matter how highbrow something is, or the quality of it. What matters is how much happiness it provides to enough people. Now, Bentham was also very famously anti-community. So it's important to note that while he wished to maximise happiness for the community, he saw community in a very different way from the way we might interpret it. Here's a quote from his book. "The interest of the communities is one of the most general expressions in the terminology of morals. No wonder its meaning is often lost. When it has a meaning, it is this. The community is a fictitious body composed of the individuals who are thought of as being, as it were, its members. Then, what is the interest of the community? It is the sum of the interests of the members who compose it." So we will see the term community feature a lot later on when we start to talk about other ethical theories. But really important to remember that Bentham saw community in a very simplistic way. The idea being that the community was the majority of people and what they were happy with, not necessarily the notion of a community that was thriving and basically had a range of shared interests and the like. Now, Sandel's next category, freedom, encapsulates much of the modern ideas of social justice that we will all be familiar with, from competing notions as to the concepts of human rights to ideas of equality and affirmative action. It's also fair to say that freedom is one of the most contested categories of social justice, with supporters approaching the idea from a range of political persuasions, and consequently presenting manifestly different views of what the term should mean for citizens and groups. The concept of freedom has been a bedrock of the liberalism tradition in political philosophy, which seeks to maximise free choice for all individuals, but recognises that freedom must have limits. Now, one of the original 17th century advocates for the primacy of individual freedom, John Locke, stated quite famously that liberty does not equate to licence. Now, what does this mean? Well, a more sophisticated idea of what it means has emerged in the modern era, but it can be summarised rather straightforwardly, as Parvin and Chambers have done. They say the freedom of each individual must be balanced against the freedom of others. it also needs to be balanced against other values, such as equality, social stability, and security. Important concerns related to freedom can be briefly summarised as relating to the inviolability and importance of the individual human being, which inevitably leads then to concepts of human rights and individual autonomy. Now, one of the most influential figures in this area was the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Now, he's a key advocate of the concept that humanity had an inviolability, and he really was very opposed to utilitarianism because he believed that morality is not about maximising happiness or any other end. Instead, it's about respecting persons as ends in themselves. Sandel continues that Kant argues that morality can't be based on merely empirical considerations, such as the interests, wants, desires, and preferences people have at any given time. These factors are variable and contingent, he points out, so they could hardly serve as the basis for universal moral principles, such as universal human rights. To this day, Kant is an immensely influential moral philosopher, and his emphasis on human dignity informs present-day notions of universal human rights. Now, it's important to understand what human rights are. Nickel summarises human rights as norms that aspire to protect all people everywhere from severe political, legal, and social abuses. Bites observes that human rights are generally claims that impose duties or responsibilities on an addressee or duty bearers. The right usually focuses on a freedom, protection, status, or benefit for the rights holders that they should be able to claim. And just a quote here from Parvin and Chambers, they say that human rights are therefore different to legal rights. They are not derived from laws, but are held by all individuals, regardless of the laws which happen to exist in any country, and regardless of the particular traditions or values which shape the public culture of those countries. Rights are therefore controversial. Now, Griffin has identified what he saw as three generations of rights. The first generation consists of the classic liberty rights of the 17th and 18th centuries, freedom of expression, of assembly, of worship, and the like. The second generation is made up of the welfare rights, widely supposed to be of the mid-20th century, though actually first asserted in the late Middle Ages. Things like positive rights to aid, in contrast, it's thought, to the purely negative rights of the first generation. And the third generation, the rights of our time, of the last 25 years or so, consists of solidarity rights, including, most prominently, group rights. In an international context, the codification of human rights can be found in two key documents. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, produced by the UN in 1948, and the European Convention on Human Rights, produced by the Council of Europe in 1950, which was inspired, obviously, by the Universal Declaration. Now, the European Convention on Human Rights has been formally integrated into the UK law via the Human Rights Act 1998. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights begins with a vital premise that humans are inalienable, meaning that they cannot be removed, transferred, or ignored. Now, it's also important to understand types of rights. And rights largely fall into three categories: absolute, limited, and qualified. Absolute rights are rights where a right should always be respected, such as the right to life or the right to be free from torture and inhuman treatment. Limited rights is where a right can be removed by the state under certain circumstances, such as the right to liberty if one commits a crime serious enough for imprisonment. And lastly, qualified rights, and this is where a right that you can normally expect to be respected can be restricted if it is counter to the rights of another person, or if satisfying the right is deemed not to be in the wider societal interest. This includes rights such as the right to privacy, the right to freedom of assembly, and the right to freedom of expression. Now, in terms of rights in libraries, in library and information services, the rights that are generally supported by the services provided by us are all qualified rights, such as the right to access information, the right to freedom of expression, right to privacy, and the right to protection of intellectual property. None of these rights are absolute, so supporting them often means balancing the rights of wider society or other individuals and groups against each other. And this is often a potentially controversial thing to do and can lead to conflict and ethical dilemmas. Now, we touched on negative and positive rights earlier, but just to define them further for you. The ideas relating to how rights should be applied in societies is contested in terms of these two categories. Positive rights consider the notion that citizens have a set of expectations as to the goods they should expect to receive from the state. Often referred to as welfare rights, they incorporate issues such as education, health, unemployment benefits, and other public goods. The opposition to positive rights, negative rights, are based around the notion that people's interests should not be unjustly interfered with by the state, and that the overriding maxim should be one of freedom to pursue one's own interests first and foremost. Now, one of the main proponents of positive rights was the philosopher John Rawls. In his highly influential book, A Theory of Justice, he proposed a range of ideas that remain a cornerstone of liberal politics for many people. His approach respected human rights, but suggested that in doing so, states must help empower individuals through two principles of justice. The first principle: each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. And the second principle: social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged, and B, attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Rawls conceived a thought experiment called the Veil of Ignorance, because he believed this selection of rights were merely the logical choices that any rational human being would make for a just society if making the choice behind what he called the Veil of Ignorance. Behind this veil, the human being or the human beings designing society would have no concept of their own eventual social status, or any talents that they may be born with, or any conception of the good. And for Rawls, this original position, as he called it, inhabited by the designers of the just society, would lead them to choose principles of justice that adjudicate fairly between different sorts of people. Now, negative rights, on the other hand, inform the thinking of many who label their beliefs as libertarian in origin, and can often mean mistrust of state intervention, publicly funded services, and taxation. For negative rights philosophers, the concept of self-ownership is of paramount importance, and the freedom to choose how their interests are advanced should be theirs and theirs alone. Now, in terms of the debate between positive and negative, modern-day negative rights arguments have largely emerged in opposition to Rawls's egalitarian liberalism that he posited in his A Theory of Justice. And as Parvin and Chambers say, indeed, the preeminent libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick wrote his Anarchy, State and Utopia as a direct rebuttal of the liberal, egalitarian, redistributive state defended by Rawls. The book was published in 1974, 3 years after Rawls's book, and set in motion a fierce debate between libertarians and egalitarians about the nature of freedom and justice, which dominated political philosophy in the 70s and early 80s, and continues to this day. Now, an important tenet of liberal philosophy, and one that's very, very important in terms of librarianship, is the notion of neutrality. Now, neutrality of the state was adhered to by both Kant and Rawls, and it's the idea that the state should be neutral with respect to competing visions of the good life. From the point of view of how Rawls saw this, Rawlsian state neutrality requires that the state does not make judgments about the relative value of competing ways of life. Policy and laws, according to political liberalism, cannot be justified by appealing to any comprehensive conception of the good. So, the state may not fund particularly valuable ways of life, cultures, art forms, sports and so on, because they are valuable. So neutrality is something that is constantly under debate, and really you have to understand why it exists and what the arguments were for it before you can actually attempt to take it down. So Scher, in his attack on neutrality, summarised the three distinct justifications that have been posited by people who support it. So firstly, respect for individual autonomy. Societies should respect the choices and values of each individual rather than imposing any worldview or choices on them. Prophylactic neutrality. Neutrality is a protection for citizens against policies that may harm them. Bureaucracies can be insensitive, arrogant and self-perpetuating, and efforts to suppress the bad can lead to the suppression of the merely unpopular. And lastly, respect for different perceptions of the common good. The notion of the common good can be a nebulous concept, but it's generally summarised as facilities, whether material, cultural or institutional, that the members of a community provide to all members in order to fulfil a relational obligation they all have to care for certain interests that they have in common. Now, that's a good description, but it might seem complex. If we consider libraries, services like public libraries are essentially what we're talking about here. They would be a common good. So the controversy comes then when what that common good actually contains. So will it contain books that perhaps offend one group or some individuals? And is that a problem? Should the library be neutral when it's providing those books, or is neutrality a problem when it does provide those books? Now, critiques of neutrality have come quite strongly from different groups, and they've emerged from the perspective of the idea that a state can never really be neutral, but that instead neutrality conceals a state bestowing on citizens the views of a power hegemonic group, and in the case of Western states, that would be the propertied white male. A very important feminist critique towards a feminist theory of a state by Catherine McKinnon argues that the state is male in the feminist sense. The law sees and treats women the way men see and treat women. The liberal state coercively and authoritatively constitutes the social order in the interests of men as a gender, through its legitimating norms, forms, relation to society, and substantive policies. The state's formal norms recapitulate the male point of view on the level of design. And another important critique comes from Iris Marion Young, who is a philosopher, and she said the stances of detachment and dispassion that supposedly produce impartiality are attained only by abstracting from the particularities of situation, feeling, affiliation, and point of view. It's an impossible ideal because the particularities of context cannot and should not be removed from moral reasoning. Finally, the ideal of impartiality serves ideological functions. It masks the ways in which the particular perspectives of dominant groups claim universality and helps justify hierarchical decision-making structures. And Parvin and Chambers summarise this. They say the result of a policy of supposed neutrality is the perceptions of the dominant group are presented as universal and objective, and that subordinate groups are silenced and portrayed as inferior. Moreover, because the dominant standpoint is presented as a neutral standpoint, it cannot be challenged. And this is an extremely important critique of neutrality, the idea being that neutrality itself is some kind of great good that if we challenge it, we're actually being biased by challenging it. The flip of the argument is that neutrality is in itself biased because it favours one particular group who designed it in the first place. And Michael Sandel himself also talked about neutrality. He summarised the dilemma early in his career when he stated that the issue is not whether individual or communal claims should carry greater weight, but whether the principles of justice that govern the basic structure of society can be neutral with respect to the competing moral and religious convictions its citizens espouse. And much later, when he was reflecting on the issue, Sandel suggests that liberal neutrality makes it difficult to cultivate the solidarity and sense of community on which democratic citizenship depends, since it simply does not advocate the taking of sides on matters of moral importance. Now, it's important to reflect on neutrality and both the criticisms of it and justifications of it in terms of your own particular approach to practice. But understanding both sides of the argument is extremely important. Sandel's last category is virtue, and he argues that modern theories of justice try to separate questions of fairness and rights from arguments about honour, virtue, and moral desert. They seek principles of justice that are neutral among ends and enable people to choose and pursue their ends for themselves. For ancient philosophers like Aristotle, the notion of a virtuous life informed the concept of living the good life and being a good person, and the cultivation of virtue was the highest aspiration for a human being. Aristotle conceived the idea of eudaimonia, which can be translated in modern terms to be related to happiness, well-being and flourishing. So it's not happiness in a Bentham type way, it's happiness in terms of making the most of who you are as a person, flourishing as a human being, and being the best person you can essentially be. So it's not happiness in that utilitarian sense as relating to pleasure-pain, but actually related to the cultivation of a life that one feels is well lived. Aristotle's ethical approach to virtue was about individuals developing specific dispositions to act in virtuous ways. He considered individual dispositions to be relatable on a scale between excess and deficiency, with the ideal disposition being a mean for each category. The virtuous disposition then lay between two other dispositions, both believed by Aristotle to be vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. Another idea in virtue ethics relates to the promotion of civic values, that is, the values related to people's beliefs, commitments, capabilities and actions as members or prospective members of communities. And the alignment of the cultivation of virtue with being a good citizen is an important one to consider when we consider contemporary policy issues. Now, community is very important in terms of virtue ethics. Philosophers such as Michael Sandel, Alistair MacIntyre, Charles Taylor, and Michael Walzer were dubbed with the label of communitarians. And they argued that a societal focus on individual freedom and autonomy meant that citizens were viewed as atomised individuals, all involved in maximising their own position in opposition to others. The communitarians believed that this was a reductive way of looking at human beings, and it ignored major influences such as family, community, and country that were a major part of someone's identity. MacIntyre's key critique of liberalism derives from a judgment that the best of human life, that in which the tradition of the virtues is most adequately embodied, is lived by those engaged in constructing and sustaining forms of community directed towards the shared achievement of those common goods, without which the ultimate human good cannot be achieved. Now, this is clearly a conflict with rights-based approaches that advocates no one single conception of the common good or morality that should predominate in society. And Sandel's approach to communitarianism, he similarly questioned whether a just society could emerge as a result of a focus on a neutral society that privileged the goals and aspirations of individuals over those of the community. He says at issue is not whether individual or communal claims should carry greater weight, but whether the principles of justice that govern the basic structure of society can be neutral with respect to the competing moral and religious convictions its citizens espouse. The fundamental question, in other words, is whether the right is prior to the good. So that summarises the three categories of welfare, freedom and virtue. And we will consider these throughout the videos, but obviously we will consider them firstly in part 2 of this video. So the next section relates to leading ethical thinkers in libraries. And I'll pause for a second if you want to take a break before we begin that part of the video. Now, leading thinkers in libraries in terms of ethics. We're going to go through a few of the key thinkers in libraries. I focus specifically on people who have tried to produce essentially a philosophy of librarianship. There are many other books on ethics in libraries that talk about things in a very broad way, but in a very excellent way. And if you want to get some recommendations for other books that are useful, then please consult the literature review that was produced for the Reveal project. So the first thinker I want you to focus on is Ranganathan and his 5 laws. And this is arguably one of the most well-known attempts at producing a philosophy of librarianship. His 5 laws are: books are for use, for every reader his or her book, for every book its reader, save the time of the reader, and a library is a growing organism. Now, how can we interpret these? They have been interpreted over the years in many ways, but I'm going to give you what is a general interpretation that most people would probably agree with. So books are for use emphasises that the resources libraries hold are there to be utilised by the community, not as museum pieces, but as active resources, and that libraries should be proactive in communicating their value to users. For every reader has our book emphasises that communities consist of individuals who have a wide range of interests that libraries should seek to serve. This serves a mission of equity of access. For every book its reader emphasises that resources are subjective, and just because one person in a community may disagree with what is in a book, there will be someone out there who wishes to hear the message, and this value serves the concept of intellectual freedom. Save the time of reader emphasises that librarians should make access to information as seamless and easy as possible. This value reflects a focus on openness of systems and rational organisation of materials to facilitate access. And lastly, a library is a growing organism. Emphasis here is that human knowledge is constantly evolving and that libraries should always seek to provide access to it. So that's the 5 laws of Ranganathan. Again, they have been interpreted over the years in various ways, but I think the 5 interpretations I've provided here are a relatively well-agreed set of interpretations. But again, you're open to explore the book further yourself and see if you agree. And the next library thinker I'm going to focus on is D.J. Foskett and his Creed. Now, the Creed of a Librarian, as it was called, was a speech that Foskett gave in 1962 to librarians in Northern England. And he was concerned at the outset of the speech with what he saw as a limited engagement by the profession with discovering a philosophy of librarianship, suggesting that in the professional literature, such discussions, and I quote, consist of ponderous platitudes, pious hopes, complaints and criticisms, and very occasionally a quest for normative principles by whose light we can illuminate our practice. And rather sharply he added that many librarians have maintained that we must not start dreaming about a professional philosophy because it would interfere with our efficiency. Now, Foskett saw this as a Philistine approach to the philosophy of the work that we undertake, which he believes is at odds with a true professional outlook. He said one's attitude towards the body of knowledge and technique that constitute professional equipment is coloured by a sense of purpose, and that the putting in order of that knowledge in the professional mind is inspired and directed by the end for which it is acquired. If we say we have no philosophy, it may be that we deceive ourselves, that we are unable or unwilling to call our system of knowledge a philosophical system. Now, the title of the speech, or pamphlet, was certainly guaranteed to raise some hackles, as it is in full: the Creed of a Librarian, no politics, no religion, and no morals. And as such, it has been interpreted over the years as a significant argument for neutrality in libraries. However, he argued for neutrality based on empathy for the worldviews of others, but tempered with the importance of the knowledge and skills of the librarian in helping guide the patron to alternative viewpoints. He says, if the librarian has no politics, no religion, and no morals, he can have all politics, all religions, and all morals. So it's an interesting creed, and one that certainly, as I say, has been criticised over the years as essentially being a backbone of neutrality. But when you delve deeper into it, it's actually more than that. It's about empathy for other people's point of view, to try and guide them towards things that might actually open their mind in some way. And the next library thinker is Jesse Shearer and his Sociological Foundations. Now, this book was essentially a set of speeches that he wrote for librarians in India. And within the speeches, he identified 2 threads that he believed a profession needs to be able to consider itself a profession. And these are, firstly, service to society, as in a high sense of purpose and dedication. And 2, intellectual content, a body of intellectual knowledge, a code of fundamental theory, as well as a corpus of practice. Now, it was in this second category that Shearer detected certain major problems for librarianship, asking, what are the intellectual foundations of librarianship? What is its body of fundamental knowledge? Now, Shearer saw librarians as mediators. He says, what is it the librarians do that no one else does? And convinced that the role of the librarian in society is to maximise the utilisation of graphic records for the benefit of society. In other words, his function is to serve as a mediator between man and graphic records, whatever form contributes to the advancement of human knowledge. Shearer utilised the triangle as an analogy for how he sees this mediation, with on one side of the triangle books, the other side people, and the base of the triangle, books and people brought together. Now, an important point to note regarding Shearer's exploration of librarianship is his focus on both individuals and communities. Importantly for Shearer, the librarian works with the reader as an individual, and through the individual he reaches society. The profession then must be concerned with the impact of graphic records upon both the individual and society. He argues that while there are similarities related to how individuals and the wider society relate to knowledge, there are also significant differences that cannot be lost when serving users, and that the profession has in the past more or less overlooked these. In terms of knowledge in society, where the collective knowledge of humanity is essentially a store that belongs to everyone, and this is something the library profession must be mindful of, the relationship of the individual with knowledge transcends the information store. More artfully expressed, Shearer stated that the individual can appreciate and comprehend the beauty and the texture of human life, as it has been recorded in the transcript of human adventure, in ways that society collectively can never understand. And Shearer also wanted librarians to view the world as a series of cultures, not one culture. He argues for the profession to embrace this understanding, and he said, "I would emphasise various cultures because cultures are not alike in their utilisation of knowledge, and certainly we cannot understand our own culture if we regard it as an isolated phenomenon. We must look at our culture in terms of other cultures, other values, other forms or patterns of right and wrong, other moves, and other ethical systems." So the next library thinker we'll focus on is Michael Gorman and his enduring values. And Michael Gorman makes it very clear in the first edition of Our Enduring Values that he's a great admirer of the work of Jesse Shearer, who I've just discussed. Michael Gorman first presented his enduring values in a book published in 2000, which he has revisited in a second edition in 2015. And he identified 8 themes which he refers to as the enduring values of librarianship. And these values are stewardship, service, intellectual freedom, equity of access, privacy, literacy and learning, rationalism, and democracy. Stewardship. For Gorman, this encompasses 3 key components. Firstly, it involves safeguarding knowledge to ensure its transmission to future generations. Secondly, it entails developing and implementing librarian training programs that uphold core values. Lastly, it centres on cultivating trust within the communities served by libraries. Service emphasises the commitment to creating user-friendly libraries, demonstrating courtesy and approachability, and evaluating all projects and plans with a focus on service. And this value strongly aligns with Foskett's principles of supporting the disadvantaged, particularly evident in public libraries where the young and economically challenged senior citizens are the most prominent users, groups that hold less power within society. Intellectual freedom. Here Gorman stresses the significance of intellectual freedom as defining a value that must be actively safeguarded, especially as laws may change over time, potentially restricting free speech on various subjects. In advocating intellectual freedom, librarians should act impartially, disregarding personal opinions or pressure from parties seeking to restrict access to knowledge. However, Gorman acknowledges the ongoing challenge of censorship, particularly in smaller communities or school libraries where interest groups may exert some influence. In such cases, he suggests pragmatic compromises instead of librarians leaving their positions, as long as they still work towards greater intellectual freedom and oppose censorship, especially when it arises in reaction to new technologies like internet filtering, which may be perceived as dangerous, but are not entirely negative. Equity of access. In many of these values, there is a clear social element, and that is also true of the value of equity of access, which for Gorman is part of a concept of social justice that everyone deserves and should be given the recorded knowledge she wants, no matter who she is. Implementing this involves removing barriers to access and being sure not to favour the better off or powerful. As many things can affect a person's ability to access information, this process must be continuous. Rationalism. For Gorman, libraries as products of the Enlightenment and rationalism stand for the belief that knowledge and information enhance humanity, and no barrier should obstruct access. Rational organisation of libraries through sensible bibliographic control and practical management structures, rather than unnecessary bureaucracies, is vital. Librarians should also foster rational thinking among users, teaching not only basic skills like resource retrieval, but also critical thinking and resource evaluation to ensure appropriate selection of sources. And Gorman also points out that his critique of irrationalism is not an attack on spirituality, but a rejection of irrational beliefs in all of their forms. On literacy and learning, this value sees Gorman expressing concern about the potential division of society into 3 tiers: a reading elite, the illiterate who rely on television for information, and the illiterate. He views literacy as more than just reading, but as the ability to express oneself fully and a means of empowerment, enabling individuals to become as knowledgeable as anyone else. Gorman warns against commercial interest dictating information access, emphasising the social element present in many of these values, particularly equity of access. According to Gorman, social justice dictates that everyone, regardless of their background, deserves access to the recorded knowledge they seek, necessitating a continuous effort to remove barriers to information access. Privacy. Gorman acknowledges that technological advancements have inadvertently compromised privacy. He likens cyberspace to a medieval village, lacking privacy, and stresses the importance of librarians remaining vigilant against potential abuses of personal data. And democracy. For Gorman, ultimately, democracy underlies all of the values of librarianship, encompassing intellectual freedom, the common good, service to all, preservation of knowledge for future generations, free access to information, and non-discrimination. And Gorman asserts that being a democrat is essential for librarians, as these values provide citizens with the information they need to participate in democratic processes. And the last thinker we're going to examine is Lankes. And his new librarianship is ultimately a call for a profession in the modern era that is far more engaged in the lives of the communities that they serve. He said that too many librarians see our profession as a passive occupation. They stay safely in the background, ready to serve, but only within their libraries. That is wrong. Good librarians, the kind our communities need, see our profession as a chance not just to promote reading or inform their communities, but to make a positive difference there. And at the heart of his new vision for libraries is a more radical approach to service. Now, he makes it clear that the word radical is too often seen as a pejorative term, either as a call for an extreme left-wing viewpoint or as a call to violent extremism. In the context of librarianship, and citing examples of the profession defending citizens against surveillance and censorship, he instead interprets the term as meaning implied action, whether political or institutional, or simply how you behave and comport yourself, to seek action and change. Now, later in the work, Lankes defines what he sees as the values of librarianship. Service. In this value, Lankes focuses on the strengthening of communities we service, focusing on providing what the community needs from a basis of understanding of their needs. And he says, in enhancing or building our community members' literacy, librarians are empowering them, giving them greater power to control their situations. Learning. In this value, Lankes sees librarians as both professionals dedicated to constantly learning and supporting the same in their users. He says lifelong learning is a core value of librarians. We are constantly learning both about the subjects of interest to the communities we serve and also about librarianship itself. Intellectual freedom and safety. Lankes argues that to be a professional is to make decisions, work through ambiguity, and balance competing priorities. And this involves prioritising rights that library users have to privacy and confidentiality when accessing resources. He says, there will be a time when one community member needs to engage with people and resources that might be frowned on by other community members. We protect our members' rights to engage with these ideas. And intellectual honesty. For Lankes, being aware of and honest about our biases is a vital component of professionalism. He says, as a reflective professional, you must constantly seek out alternative views and try to understand how your viewpoint might affect the services you provide to others. Importantly, he also reminds us that this doesn't mean that you have to see all views as equally valid, and that a rational or scientific method is well known and understood to enable humans to discover truth. We do this cognizant of the realisation that we must always provide a safe place to explore and discuss unsafe ideas that may not lend themselves to a scientific approach. Now, Lankes does not believe that these values represent any single political viewpoint or vision of the good life. Instead, they represent an agreed approach to service that has filtered through generations of library professionals. And, quote directly from Lankes, he says, "The values of librarians are not those of liberals or conservatives, Democrats or Republicans. They are the values of knowledge professionals seeking to improve our communities. and they represent the collective, agreed on biases of our profession. So in summary, we've discussed in this video some key ethical theories related to social justice, and we've also discussed some key ethical thinkers and their proposals regarding a philosophy of librarianship. And hopefully you've seen a pattern of the key ethical theories appearing within the writings of the thinkers in librarianship themselves. So these larger ethical theories inform the day-to-day practice and the philosophy of librarianship itself. So in the next video, we will focus on a specific aspect of ethics in librarianship, which is CILIPS ethical framework.